The courtroom was filled with a hum of voices like a swarm of insects, restless but not yet enraged. Massive windows let in weak morning light, diffused by clouds, giving the entire room a grayish tint. People whispered, discussing the latest news or the outcome of the case that was just beginning. In the center of the room stood the judge's podium, where Judge Raymond Carter sat motionless. His figure, stern and imposing, resembled a stone statue. His face, sharp, with features chiseled by time, hid emotions, and his piercing gaze darted around the room, as if penetrating the essence of each person present. Suddenly, the massive wooden door creaked open, and Alex Kinner entered the room. His appearance caused an instant hush. The young man, barely 17, looked as if he had accidentally ended up in this place. His suit, old and clearly not his size, hung like a sack on his thin frame. His thin arms held a worn-out briefcase, and his large brown eyes nervously darted around the room, catching evaluating glances. Alex took a deep breath, as if preparing to step onto a stage where an inexorable trial awaited him. The whispering started again, but this time it was directed at him. "Who is that?" came a voice from the back row. "Is that a teenager?" A woman in a strict suit whispered in surprise to her neighbor. "Is he joking?" A man snorted, shuffling folders with documents. Alex, ignoring those around him, moved towards the defendant's table, his steps uneven but confident. At the other end of the room, at the plaintiff's table, stood Grayson Langford, a tall man with perfect posture, a gray suit from a famous designer, and the gaze of a predator. He barely noticeably smirked, looking Alex over with an air of superiority. "Is this really a courtroom or a school fair?" Langford muttered to his assistant, and the room quietly laughed. Alex felt a flush rise to his face, but he didn't let himself break. He approached the table, put down his briefcase, and, exhaling, straightened his shoulders. "Silence in the court," Judge Carter's voice rang out sharply. The whispering instantly ceased. The judge turned his gaze to Alex, furrowing his brows. His tone was cold, with a hint of disbelief. "Mr. Kinner, you claim to be representing your mother, is that correct?" Alex swallowed, trying to suppress his excitement. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, trying to speak firmly. "I represent my mother, Julia Kinner." A slight laugh came from the opposite table. Langford lazily took a pen and began twirling it in his hands, feigning boredom. "Do you understand that representing someone in court requires not only knowledge but also qualification?" the judge added. "The law allows any citizen to defend their interests in court if they do not have a lawyer," Alex countered. His voice was a bit more confident. Judge Carter raised an eyebrow for a moment. A slight surprise flashed in his eyes, which immediately disappeared. "Very well, Mr. Kinner. Let's see what you can do." Alex felt a chill run down his spine. All the attention of the room was focused on him. He had to prove not only his rightness, but also his right to be there. He took his notes out of his briefcase and slowly opened them, revealing worn pages covered in small handwriting. His breathing evened out, and his gaze became firmer. Langford lazily leaned back in his chair. "This won't take long," he tossed to his assistant. Alex raised his head, looking directly at Judge Carter. His voice sounded clear. "Your Honor, I am ready to present evidence of unjust eviction and manipulations undertaken by the plaintiff to illegally deprive us of our home." The room fell silent. Even Langford seemed to tense up. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair and folded his fingers. "Proceed, Mr. Kinner," he said, and there was a note of interest in his voice. Alex began to speak, his words sounding firm, each argument well-founded and logical. The noise in the room gradually gave way to tense attention, and even those who initially smirked began to wonder, does this guy really have a chance? Alex Kinner's world turned upside down in one night. A few months ago, he lived with his mother, Julia, in a small but cozy house on the outskirts of Hartfield, a typical American town with quiet streets, well-kept lawns, and smiling neighbors. Their home was more than just a residence. Every crack in the walls, every growth mark on the doorframe told the story of their lives. But one day, all of that became just a memory. They had just returned home after a long day. Julia, exhausted after her shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse, barely crossed the threshold. Her cough had gotten worse in the last few months, but she continued to work, trying to keep the family afloat. Alex helped her take off her coat before sitting down at the kitchen table with his books. "Alex, are you studying late into the night again?" Julia asked, her voice soft but tired. "I want to be ready for the exams," he replied, not even looking up. Julia came up to him, put her hand on his shoulder and squeezed it gently. "I'm proud of you," she said. "You'll be the first in our family to go to college." Her words filled Alex with pride. But this moment of peace was interrupted by a loud knock at the door. A man with a grim face and an official demeanor stood on the threshold. His hands held an envelope with seals. "What is this?" Julia asked, slightly frowning. The man just shrugged, handed her the envelope, and left. Julia opened it, and her face paled. "Eviction notice," she whispered, barely holding the paper in her hands. Alex took the document and quickly scanned the lines. It stated that their home was being taken over by the landowner, Joseph Harknell, due to non-payment of rent. This was absurd. The house had long been paid off, and they had no debts. But at the bottom of the document was a seal confirming its legality. The next day, Alex and Julia went to Harknell's office. It was located in a high-rise building in the city center, among gleaming glass facades and powerful cars. They were made to wait in the reception area for almost an hour before the secretary, without looking up, pointed them to the door. Harknell was a middle-aged man with a sharp chin and an icy gaze. He sat behind a massive desk adorned with crystals and photographs, clearly chosen to display his wealth. "I thought you had already moved out," he said emotionlessly, not even inviting them to sit. Julia tried to explain that it was a mistake, but Harknell just waved her off. "All the documents are in order. If you have any questions, go to court." His voice was so cold that Alex felt a knot in his stomach. They left, but Alex swore to himself that he would not let this man ruin their lives. The following weeks were a nightmare. Julia, depressed and exhausted, tried to find help from local lawyers, but their services were too expensive. Alex had to drop out of school to take care of his mother, whose health was getting worse. They moved into an old motel on the outskirts of town, where the walls smelled of dampness and the windows barely closed. But one day, rummaging through an old bookstore, Alex found something that changed his life. It was a thick legal book, clearly having seen better days. Its pages were stained with coffee, and the cover resembled a piece of cardboard. On the title page, it said, "Basics of American Law for Beginners." Alex ran his finger over the letters, feeling like he was holding something important. "This is a sign," he whispered to himself. From that night on, everything changed. While Julia slept in the next room, Alex would light a dim lamp and immerse himself in the world of laws and precedents. He studied terms, read about cases similar to theirs, and wrote down every important detail. His head ached, and his eyes watered from lack of sleep, but he didn't give up. One evening, as Alex was rereading the materials, Julia came up to him and put her hand on his shoulder. "You're doing too much for me, Alex," she said, her voice trembling. "You deserve it, Mom," he replied, not looking up from the book. "I'll find a way." Her eyes filled with tears, but she couldn't find the words to stop him. Soon, Alex prepared his arguments. He rewrote his notes on clean paper, put them in an old briefcase, and went to file a petition in court. Surrounded by lawyers in expensive suits, he looked out of place, but his voice sounded confident. Judge Carter, who was reviewing the application, looked at the teenager through his glasses. "Do you really think you can handle this case?" he asked, not hiding his skepticism. "I have no other choice, Your Honor," Alex replied. The judge lingered on him for a moment, as if trying to understand who was before him. Then he set the application aside. "Very well, Mr. Kinner. See you in court." That day marked the beginning of his journey. The path was dangerous, thorny, and full of doubts, but Alex was ready to fight. For himself, for his mother, for their home. The sun lazily rose over the horizon, filtering through the dusty windows of the courtroom. Alex Kinner sat at the wooden defendant's table, his gaze focused on the notes spread out before him. He had barely slept at night, going over the arguments he intended to present. His fingers nervously flipped through the pages covered in small notes. This was not just preparation, it was his shield, the only thing standing between his family and ruin. At the other end of the room, the plaintiff, Joseph Harknell, sat with his lawyer, Grayson Langford. Langford seemed the embodiment of confidence. He lazily studied some papers, as if the case was already won. His suit fit perfectly, the cuffs of his shirt slightly peeking out from under his jacket. He looked at Alex with a slight smirk, in which one could read clear condescension. "This won't take long," Langford whispered to his client. Harknell nodded, crossing his arms over his chest. His cold gaze slid over Alex's figure, as if saying, "You are just an obstacle." Judge Raymond Carter took his seat, his stern face expressing nothing but concentration. The room instantly fell silent. The hum of voices gave way to silence filled with anticipation. Carter leaned forward slightly and struck the gavel. "The session has begun." He turned his gaze to Langford, who immediately stood up, his movements precise and confident. "Your Honor, this case is, in essence, elementary," Langford began with a slight mockery in his voice. "My client, Mr. Harknell, legally owns the property. The eviction notice meets all requirements." Langford turned to the room like an actor accustomed to applause. "And as far as I understand," he continued, looking directly at Alex, "our opponent is a teenager without legal education. Frankly, Your Honor, I respect his audacity, but this is a waste of time." Judge Carter looked skeptically and turned to Alex. "Mr. Kinner, do you have anything to say?" Alex stood up. He felt as if the weight of the room was pressing down on his shoulders. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on him, and the pressure became almost tangible. But he took a deep breath, suppressing the tremor in his voice. "Your Honor," he began, evenly and clearly, "I am not here to make an impression. I am here to prove that the eviction of my family was illegal and based on forged documents." A whisper ran through the room again, but Carter struck the gavel. "Continue," he said briefly. Alex began to present his arguments. First, he described the chronology of events, how his family received the eviction notice, how they tried to contact Harknell, and how they were ignored. He supported his words with copies of letters, dated and certified. His voice, though not loud, sounded confident. Langford initially listened with a lazy expression, but gradually his face began to change. When Alex moved on to legal arguments, citing articles of legislation, Langford's eyes narrowed slightly. "This is impressive," Langford interrupted, rising from his seat. "But your quotes are just text from a book, Mr. Kinner. You don't have the experience to interpret them correctly." Alex raised his gaze, his face expressing calm confidence. "Perhaps I don't have the experience, Mr. Langford," he replied, "but the law is interpreted not by the lawyer, but by the court. And I believe that Judge Carter is capable of understanding this better than anyone here." A murmur of approval ran through the room. Even Judge Carter slightly smiled, but quickly regained his seriousness. Then Alex presented the key argument. He held up the document that lay on his table. It was the very eviction notice. "Your Honor," Alex began, holding it up so everyone could see, "this document is the basis of the plaintiff's case. But if you notice the signature at the bottom, it belongs to a notary who left the state 2 years before the alleged signing date." The room gasped. Judge Carter frowned, and Langford, for the first time during the entire session, looked troubled. "This is a serious statement, Mr. Kinner," the judge said. "I have prepared evidence," Alex continued. He took out copies of the record of the notary's retirement, certified by state archives. Carter took the documents and examined them carefully. Langford began to shuffle his papers, his movements sharp, almost nervous. "These documents," Langford began, but the judge raised his hand, stopping him. "Mr. Langford, I think your client has some explaining to do." For Alex, this was a moment of triumph, but he did not allow himself to relax. His heart was beating wildly, but outwardly he remained calm. He looked straight ahead, ignoring the tense gazes directed at him. Judge Carter put the documents on the table. His face became sterner. "We will continue the hearing after the break," he announced. "But Mr. Langford, I advise you to prepare explanations regarding this evidence." With these words, he struck the gavel, and the courtroom filled with whispers. When Alex returned to his seat, he finally allowed himself to exhale. His hands trembled slightly, but he was satisfied. There was still a lot of work ahead, but he already felt that he had turned the tide. For the first time in a long time, he saw not doubt but respect in people's faces. Returning after the break, the courtroom was no longer the same. Something had changed. The hum of voices, which previously had a mocking and condescending tone, now sounded tense. People were discussing the evidence presented by Alex Kinner and trying to understand how a teenager could challenge the position of an experienced lawyer like Grayson Langford. Alex again took his place at the defendant's table. His briefcase lay next to him, and his hands carefully sorted through the documents. Although his gaze was focused, a storm raged within him. Each heartbeat echoed in his ears. He knew this was just the beginning. Langford was not one to give up without a fight. At the opposite end of the room, Grayson Langford maintained his composure, but his eyes betrayed tension. He flipped through his papers, occasionally casting dark glances at his client, Joseph Harknell. Harknell seemed to be realizing that the situation was becoming serious. Judge Raymond Carter took his seat on the podium, his stern gaze sweeping the room. He tapped the gavel, and the hum of voices instantly ceased. "The session continues," he announced. "Mr. Langford," the judge began, turning his gaze to the lawyer. "Do you have any explanations regarding the evidence presented by Mr. Kinner?" Langford stood up. His movements were measured, but there was hidden aggression in his voice. "Your Honor," he began, "I question the authenticity of this evidence. The eviction notice is an official document certified by a notary. The claim that the signature is forged is based solely on Mr. Kinner's words." Alex raised his gaze. His voice sounded steady, but with a firmness he drew from his confidence. "Your Honor, my evidence is not just words. These are official records from the State Archive, which I have presented to you. They confirm that the notary who signed the document left office 2 years before the indicated date. I also have statements from several witnesses ready to confirm this information." The room held its breath. Even Langford was silent for a moment, pondering what he had heard. Judge Carter frowned, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Mr. Langford," the judge continued, "if you have counter-arguments, I would like to hear them." Langford gathered his thoughts and tried to divert attention from the essence of the matter. "Your Honor, do not forget that before you stands a teenager. He has no legal education and may have misinterpreted the information. We cannot put the reputation of my client at risk based on questionable assumptions." Alex felt his fists clench, but he maintained his composure. Standing up, he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my arguments are based on facts, not assumptions. If Mr. Langford considers them insufficient, I am ready to present another piece of evidence." Alex took out another folder from his briefcase. He held it up so that the judge in the room could see. "These are Mr. Harknell's bank statements for the past year," he said, his voice louder than before. "They show that on the same days when, according to my client, he was signing the notice, he was in another state. This is confirmed by his expenses and hotel registration." The room whispered again. Even Carter, who always seemed imperturbable, looked at Langford for a moment with a slight surprise. "Can you comment on this, Mr. Langford?" the judge asked. Langford looked as if he had been punched in the gut. He opened his mouth to say something but fell silent for a moment, his self-assurance cracking. "Your Honor, this data," he began, but his voice sounded uncertain. "We need time to verify its authenticity." "Time, Mr. Langford," the judge said, his voice growing colder, "will not help you if your client forged the documents. Mr. Kinner, your evidence is accepted." At that moment, the room was completely on Alex's side. People exchanged approving glances, and some even applauded quietly. Langford looked like a man who realized the battle was lost but was not yet ready to admit it. Joseph Harknell sat motionless, his face pale. He gripped the armrests of his chair as if that could keep him from total collapse. Alex returned to his seat. His heart was beating so loudly that he could barely hear what was happening around him. He knew he had done something incredible, but he understood that it was not yet time to relax. The judge struck the gavel again. "We will continue the proceedings tomorrow. Mr. Langford, I hope you will be able to prepare your response." Alex felt the tension lift from him. He gathered his papers, feeling the judge's gaze following him. In that gaze, there was no longer any doubt, only respect and interest. When Alex left the courtroom, he heard whispers and quiet applause. For the first time, he felt that he was on the path to victory. This chapter shows the turning point in the case where Alex makes the judge and the room see the truth. His ability to maintain composure under pressure and use evidence makes him not just a teenager, but a true fighter for justice. The courtroom was packed. It seemed as if everyone in Hartfield had come to see how this unusual trial would end. The atmosphere was so tense that even the smallest rustles, such as the sound of papers or muffled coughs, echoed. Alex Kinner sat at his table, intently reviewing his notes. He had to endure the final round of the verbal duel, and he felt that everything depended on it. He found it unbearable to think that defeat could leave them homeless forever. Judge Raymond Carter entered the room and took his seat. His face, as always, remained inscrutable, but his gaze swept the room with a slight squint, as if assessing who was ready for today. "The session continues," he said, striking the gavel. The judge turned his gaze to the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Langford, are you ready to present your response to Mr. Kinner's evidence?" Grayson Langford stood up. His face still expressed confidence, but there was tension in his eyes. He knew his reputation as a lawyer was on the line. "Your Honor," he began, not looking in Alex's direction, "I acknowledge that the evidence presented by Mr. Kinner deserves attention. However, I insist that it is misinterpreted. My client has every reason to believe that the eviction notice was issued legally." Langford approached the judge's table, trying to show his resolve. "Even if there were minor errors in the documents, they do not change the essence of the case. My client owns this property, and the defendant owes him a significant sum." Alex jumped to his feet, his voice firm but not harsh. "Your Honor, I object. These are not minor errors. This is forgery, and I can prove that Mr. Harknell knew about the inconsistencies in the documents, but still tried to evict us." Carter raised his hand, demanding silence. "Mr. Kinner, you will have your chance to respond. Mr. Langford, continue." Langford hesitated, then returned to his seat. His next statement sounded much less confident. "Your Honor, I leave the matter to your discretion." Now it was Alex's turn. He stood up, gathering all his strength, and looked directly into the judge's eyes. "Your Honor, I want to present the final piece of evidence that fully confirms my words." Alex took out a copy of a letter signed by Joseph Harknell from his briefcase. It was a letter with threats sent to Julia Kinner a month before the eviction notice. "This letter proves that Mr. Harknell intentionally created conditions to force us out of our home," Alex explained, showing the document to the judge. Carter frowned and picked up the sheet, examining it carefully. The room held its breath. Even Harknell, sitting at his table, could not hide his tension. "It is clearly stated here that Mr. Harknell threatened your mother with eviction if she did not agree to sign a lease agreement, which at that time was illegal. Do you have anything to say, Mr. Harknell?" the judge asked sternly. Harknell tried to mutter something, but his voice was barely audible. Langford tried to take control of the situation, but the judge stopped him with a gesture. There was a silence that seemed eternal. Finally, Judge Carter sighed and set the letter aside. "After carefully reviewing the evidence and hearing both sides, I render my decision. The eviction notice was based on forged documents. The plaintiff acted illegally and with the intent to deceive the court." These words were a triumph for Alex. The room began to whisper, which quickly turned into applause. Julia Kinner, sitting in the back row, covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "The court rules in favor of the defendant," the judge continued. "The plaintiff is obligated to compensate the defendant for all expenses, including moral damages. The session is closed." Carter struck the gavel, but the room erupted in applause. Alex finally allowed himself to smile, his eyes filling with tears of relief. When the room began to empty, Judge Carter approached Alex. His stern face softened, and he extended his hand. "Mr. Kinner, you have proven not only your rightness, but also your courage. You remind me that the law can be a force for good if backed by a person with pure intentions." Alex shook his hand, his voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Your Honor. I just wanted to protect my family." Carter smiled for the first time during the entire process. "If you decide to study law, find me. I would like to be your mentor." When Alex and Julia left the courthouse, they were met with smiles and words of support on the street. Alex looked at his mother, who looked at him with pride. "You did it, Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You saved us." He hugged her, feeling the tension of the past months finally dissipate. "We did it together, Mom. Now everything will be different." The day was sunny but cool. The sky over Hartfield was clear, as if Providence itself was celebrating Alex Kinner's victory. He stood at the door of a new home, modest but cozy, which he could finally call his own. Julia Kinner came out onto the porch, her eyes shining with joy, and her face calm for the first time in a long while. "Alex, are you sure you can handle this?" she asked, packing books into his old worn-out backpack. Alex smiled. His face, though tired from all the trials, radiated confidence. He put the backpack on his shoulder and looked at his mother. "If I could defend you in court, then getting into college will be a breeze," he replied, smiling slightly. Julia laughed, but her voice trembled with emotion. She approached her son and hugged him, as if afraid to let go. "I am so proud of you, Alex. You did the impossible." Memories of the court still lingered in his mind. He heard Judge Carter's words, "If you decide to study law, find me. I would like to be your mentor." These words had taken root in Alex's heart. He knew the world was unfair, and people like his mother often became victims. But now he felt he had the strength to change something. Later that day, Alex and Julia sat at the kitchen table, which they had managed to buy after receiving compensation. On the table was a simple dinner, pasta and bread. Julia suddenly broke the silence. "Alex, do you think it was all worth it?" He looked up. In her eyes there was a hint of doubt, but more concern. Was it worth fighting such a giant, risking everything? Alex put down his fork, his gaze serious. "Mom, if we hadn't fought, they would have taken everything. Not just our home, but our belief in justice. I realize that sometimes you have to stand up for what is right, even if it's hard." Julia smiled weakly. "You're right, and you proved it." The next day, Alex decided to visit the courthouse. He stopped at its massive doors and looked at them for a long time. Just a few months ago, he had entered with trembling hands and a heart full of fear. But now this place had become a symbol of his victory, not just over Harknell, but over himself. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out to him, "Mr. Kinner, I did not expect to see you here so soon." Alex turned around and saw Judge Carter. He was not wearing his stern robe, but a simple gray suit, which made him seem less intimidating. "Your Honor," Alex was slightly embarrassed but quickly straightened up. "I wanted to thank you for everything." Carter nodded and smiled. "No, Mr. Kinner, it is you who deserve thanks. You reminded me why I chose this profession." He paused, then added, "My hand remains extended, Alex. If you decide to study law, I would be happy to help you. People like you are needed in this system." Alex felt his heart swell with pride. "Thank you, Your Honor. I will accept your offer." That evening, Alex returned home and sat down at the old table, which now held law books. One of them was the very book he had found in the bookstore. Its worn cover and yellowed pages had become a symbol of the beginning of his journey. Alex opened the first page, took a pen, and began to write down his thoughts. He was not writing just for himself. He was writing for everyone who might face injustice and feel that they had no strength to fight. He wanted to become the voice of those who had lost hope. Several months passed. Alex enrolled in college, choosing law as his major. He regularly communicated with Judge Carter, who became his mentor. Julia, whose health had noticeably improved, started working again, but now not for survival, but for pleasure. One day, passing by his old house, Alex stopped and smiled. That place was no longer filled with pain or bitterness. It had become a symbol that even the toughest battles could be won if you believed in yourself and fought to the end. This story came to an end, but Alex's journey was just beginning. He looked to the future with confidence and determination. He still had a long way to go, but he already knew one thing. Every person was capable of more than they thought, and perhaps one day he would return to that very courtroom, but not as a teenager, but as a lawyer fighting for justice for others.